title confirmed. The food you eat in the first 72 hours is delivering internal dose with every bite. You are hungry. That is the second problem. The first problem was thirst. And if you have been paying attention to this channel, you already know that the water coming from your tap is not the water that was in the pipe before the event, that purification tablets address the wrong contamination class, and that the only safe water in the first 72 hours is water that was sealed before the fallout began. The hunger problem is structurally identical and operationally worse, because the food in your shelter, the food you stocked, the food you found, the food that was in your kitchen when the blast occurred, is subject to a contamination matrix that is more complex than the water problem and less understood by virtually everyone who has written a survival guide for a general audience. Let us establish the baseline. Internal contamination, the ingestion or inhalation of radioactive material, is categorically different from external exposure in one critical respect. The source of the dose is inside you. External radiation passes through tissue and exits. Internal contamination deposits in tissue and continues to irradiate from within for as long as the isotope remains in the body and as long as the isotope retains sufficient activity.
Here you go, drink this.
The biological half-life of cesium, 137 in human muscle tissue, is approximately 70 days. The physical half-life of cesium-137 is 30 years. Every gram of contaminated food you ingest deposits cesium ions that will irradiate your muscle tissue from inside for the next 70 days, during which your immune system, already stressed by external exposure, must also manage the ongoing internal dose. You are not just eating food. You are establishing a radiation source inside your own body that the rule of sevens cannot touch, because the rule of sevens describes what is happening outside you, and this is happening inside you. And those are different physics operating on different timelines. The 15-minute algorithm told you to shelter immediately. The correct food protocol requires you to have thought about this before the event, because the decisions that determine your internal contamination load from food are largely made in the preparation phase, not the response phase. The food that saves you is the food that was sealed before the fallout began. Factory-sealed cans, foil-sealed packages, bottles with intact factory seals. These are not contaminated. The food that kills you slowly is the food that was exposed to fallout dust, directly through open containers, through packaging compromised by blast overpressure, through produce that was outside when the fallout descended. The line between safe and unsafe food is a seal, and the seal is a binary condition. Either it was intact before the fallout reached it, or it was not. There is no partial protection and no field test that a civilian can perform to determine which side of that line a given food item is on. Now, the specific threats. Radioiodine, iodine 131, has an 8-day half-life and concentrates in the food chain through a specific pathway that the survival literature consistently underweights. Fallout containing I-131 deposits on grass and vegetation. Dairy cattle and goats consume contaminated grass. The I-131 concentrates in the milk. Fresh milk produced in the affected area in the days after the event contains radioiodine at levels that can deliver significant thyroid dose, particularly to children whose thyroids are smaller and whose iodine uptake rates are higher than adults. This is not a theoretical concern. The Chernobyl data documents thyroid cancer clusters in children in Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia that are directly attributable to I-131 ingestion through contaminated milk consumed in the days after the accident, before any consumption advisory was issued. The children who drank the milk did not know it was contaminated. The milk tasted like milk. The physics did not announce itself. Your iodine tablet protects your thyroid from I-131. It does not protect you from cesium-137 in the food you eat. It does not protect your children's thyroids from I-131. In the milk, if they consumed the milk before you gave them the tablet. The tablet is a single-function tool that the food contamination problem will expose as inadequate in multiple dimensions simultaneously. If this is the first time you have thought about food as a radiation delivery system, subscribe now. The algorithm has several more inputs you have not yet accounted for. Strontium-90, the calcium pathway. Strontium deposits on vegetation and enters the food chain through the same grass-dairy pathway as iodine, but it also deposits directly on root vegetables, leafy greens, and anything grown in contaminated soil. Strontium-90 mimics calcium at the cellular level. The body absorbs it through the same pathway as dietary calcium and deposits it in bone. Once in bone, strontium-90 irradiates the bone marrow, the same bone marrow that produces the white blood cells, whose depletion defines the manifest illness phase of acute radiation syndrome. External exposure damages bone marrow from outside. Strontium-90 in bone irradiates it from inside. The two sources of bone marrow dose are additive. The person who sheltered correctly and avoided significant external exposure but consumed contaminated food with strontium-90 has added an internal bone marrow dose source that will operate for the full biological residence time of the isotope in their skeleton. The survival math that protected them from external exposure is now being partially undone from inside by what they ate. The cooking problem. The instinct when confronted with potentially contaminated food is to cook it. Heat destroys pathogens. Heat feels like purification. Heat is not decontamination. Cooking contaminated food does not remove radioactive isotopes. Cesium-137 does not volatilize at cooking temperatures. Strontium-90 does not volatilize at cooking temperatures. Boiling vegetables in water concentrates the dissolved isotopes in the cooking water, and if you then consume that water as broth or soup, you have consumed a concentrated version of the contamination that was in the raw vegetable. The cooking process did not make the food safer. In the case of boiled, contaminated vegetables consumed with their cooking liquid, it made the effective dose higher. Your survival instinct toward cooked food over raw food is calibrated for a biological threat that cooking addresses. It is calibrated incorrectly for a radiological threat that cooking does not address and may worsen. The carbon monoxide connection is here because it is always here. You are hungry. You are going to cook. Cooking requires a heat source. Heat sources produce CO. Your sealed shelter, correctly ventilated for CO management, requires the ventilation gap to be calibrated before cooking begins, the CO detector to be functional and monitored during cooking, and the cooking time to be minimized. The person who is hungry and frightened and cooking contaminated food in a sealed shelter without CO monitoring is compounding a food contamination problem with an atmospheric contamination problem using the same heat source. The shelter that was protecting them from external radiation is now cooking contaminated food in a CO accumulating atmosphere. The physics layers without mercy. What is actually safe to eat in the first 72 hours? Factory-sealed food that was inside the shelter before the fallout arrived. Canned food with intact seals. Commercially packaged food in sealed containers. Food that has never been exposed to the post-fallout environment. If the can was in your shelter before the event and the seal is intact, the food inside is safe. If the can was outside and has been brought in after the fallout, the exterior of the can is contaminated and must be wiped down with a damp cloth from sealed water before opening, being careful not to let the contamination on the exterior enter the food during opening. If the food was in an open container, in a bowl, on a plate, or was produce sitting on a counter, it is compromised. There is no visual indicator of this. The apple on your counter looks like an apple. The bowl of rice looks like a bowl of rice. The physics of what is on their surfaces does not change their appearance. The hunger signal will tell you that you need to eat, and that the food in front of you is food, and that the distinction between sealed and unsealed is a technicality that your body does not recognize as relevant to the meal it is demanding. Your hunger is an evolutionary signal calibrated for an environment where food visibility was the primary safety indicator. In the post-nuclear environment, food visibility is not a safety indicator. The apple that looks perfect is not perfect if it was sitting on the counter when the fallout arrived. The body cannot process this distinction. The brain must override the body. The brain must have been given the information before it was hungry, because hunger degrades the quality of the override. The rule of sevens tells you when the external environment becomes survivable. It does not tell you when the food supply becomes safe. Surface contamination on produce degrades with the physical half-life of the deposited isotopes, which means it does